Pursuant to order made on Tuesday, May 26, 2020, it is my duty to interrupt the proceedings at this time. The committee will now consider motion number 8 under government business.
Before we begin debate, I would like to inform honourable members about the way this debate will unfold.
Orders made earlier today, the chair will recognize a member of each recognized party and a member of the Green Party. Each member will be recognized for not more than 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes for questions and comments. Members may split their time with another member.
Members participating by video conference who would like to ask a question or make a comment to one of the speeches can indicate this to the speaker by using the raise hand function on the video conferencing platform. However, members participating here in the House can rise as they do usually.
The debate. Mr. Rodriguez moves that the House take note of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and measures taken by the government to respond to it. Debate. The Honourable Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, since our government last provided an economic report, COVID-19 has spread swiftly across the globe. It brought a new disease onto our headlines, our dinner table conversations, and eventually our shores. From the beginning, we followed the guidance of public health officials. Governments across Canada have put lockdown measures in place to slow the spread of the virus and ensure that our healthcare systems could deal with the scale of the challenge that we faced. Businesses closed, schools closed, people stayed home. Our daily lives became unrecognizable. Many of us stopped going to work. Many others had to face this new reality without a job and the endless worries that that brings. Many others had to go to work on the front lines, where work took on new risks and new meaning. We went months without seeing our friends and relatives in a time of great fear and concern. We looked for new ways to gather, to connect, to mark the milestones in our lives. We spent a lot of time on video calls. And most importantly, we took the time to take care of one another. The nature of this crisis is completely unprecedented. It's a public health crisis and an economic crisis. Our collective decisions as Canadians to put each other's health above all else has meant we've flattened the curve faster than many other countries. Our average daily new cases have declined by about 80% from their peak in late April. Canadians' efforts saved thousands of lives. But Canadians also made great sacrifices to get here. Millions of Canadians have lost their jobs, lost hours, or lost wages. Businesses of all sizes are still facing uncertainty.
Through rapid and broad support, our government has been able to protect millions of jobs, provide emergency income support to families, and help keep businesses afloat during the worst of the storm. This support is helping Canadians get back on their feet and has prevented long-term damage. But this pandemic is not over, and we cannot let up on our commitment to help one another. I would like to take a moment to salute the work of the Minister of Health and Dr. Tam during this crisis.
Our government is presenting an economic and fiscal snapshot. This document provides Canadians and parliamentarians with a picture of where our economy is right now. It's transparent about what we know and what we don't know. Forecasts are always uncertain. So with this snapshot, we're providing our best prediction of the economic situation in Canada to the end of the current fiscal year, to March 31st, 2021. Trying to predict further would be potentially misleading.
The The possibility of further outbreaks looms on the horizon, and accurate long-term forecasting is impossible in such a volatile environment. I know Canadians understand how hard it is to make predictions right now, so let me tell you what we know. We know that the unemployment rate went from historic lows in January to historic highs in May. We know that low-wage workers, young people, and immigrants bore the brunt of employment losses in March and April. And while some jobs returned in May, the sectors many women work in have been slower to rebound. We know many women are shouldering the burden of unpaid care work at home, looking after children and providing care for sick relatives. The lack of childcare services could delay women's return to work. We also know that vulnerable groups have been hit harder by this pandemic and are continuing to face challenges. This crisis has exposed and amplified many inequalities in Canada. I'm thinking about Canadians who work to get by on low income, people who process and prepare our food, temporary foreign workers, and our seniors in long-term care.
That energy workers faced a double hit after the shock to global commodity prices, and that employment in mining and oil and gas support services has fallen by over 15%. We know businesses are still facing challenges. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy is helping impacted businesses protect jobs and remain poised to rebound. We encourage businesses to take advantage of the program and hire more workers. We know that the best economic policy continues to be containing the spread of the virus. If we can keep the transmission rate steadily declining, we can help ensure a stable and steady economic recovery. If we don't, the gains of our sacrifices these past 4 months will be lost. Around the world, we've seen what happens when reopenings are rushed.
Our government has understood from the moment this pandemic began that it was our role to step in to support Canadians and stabilize the economy. The COVID-19 Economic Response Plan is the most comprehensive and substantial peacetime investment in Canada's history, representing more than $212 billion in direct support and nearly 14% of GDP in total support. Let me give you some numbers. About 3 million Canadian workers have had their jobs supported through the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, and that number continues to grow. Over 8 million Canadians were able to pay for groceries and rent because of the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Over 680,000 small businesses have received interest-free loans thanks to the Canada Emergency Business Account, and 15 million low and modest income Canadians have received a special GST credit top-up. 6.7 million seniors who receive the Old Age Security Pension will receive a supplementary payment this week. We have also invested in community organizations that provide services to the most vulnerable, including more than 500 women's shelters that address the immediate needs of women and children fleeing violence. The Prime Minister's leadership has shown all of Canada that their government would put workers first and be there for our most vulnerable. And if there is a resurgence, we are ready to do more.
Profound depression since the Great Depression, profound downturn since the Great Depression, our government acted to support the economy. Every investment we made was in response to COVID-19 and was time limited. From income support for Canadians to loans for Canadian businesses and nonprofits of all sizes, we worked to make sure our programs left no one behind, and we did it fast. We were guided by 3 principles: speed, scale, and simplicity. Mr. Speaker, I think we delivered on all 3. Some will criticize us on the cost of action. They'll point to the size of our deficit in 2021. It's a testament of the shock that COVID-19 had on our economy. But our government knew that the cost of inaction would have been far greater. Those who would have us do less ignore that without government action, millions of jobs would have been lost, putting the burden of debt onto families and jeopardizing Canada's resilience. At a time when Canadian workers and families are facing significant hardship, austerity and tightening your belt is not the answer. Our fiscal discipline in the years leading up to this, combined with Canadians' hard work and entrepreneurial spirit, meant that Canada was resilient and ready to face this challenge. With a crisis of this magnitude, someone was going to have to shoulder the costs, and the federal government was uniquely placed to take this responsibility on. Over the last quarter century, provincial debt has outpaced federal debt by $225 billion. Household debt to disposable income has increased to over 175%, close to a record high. To date, nearly 9 out of $10 in COVID-19 related direct support delivered to Canadians and to Canadian businesses is financed by the federal government. We took on this role because it was the right thing to do. Thanks to our rapid and substantial investments, unemployment will be lower, consumer spending will be higher, and our economy will recover sooner than had we done nothing. Si nous n'étions pas intervenus avec la subvention salariale,
if we had not stepped in with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, millions of jobs could have been lost forever during the worst of the storm. Without the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, Canadians would not have been able to cover their daily expenses. Our investments have meant that Canadians and Canadian businesses, instead of drowning in debt and closing up shop, will be better positioned to get back at it. We came into this crisis on a strong footing, with a net debt to GDP ratio considerably lower than all of our G7 peers.
Historic investments. Canada will continue to hold this low debt advantage. This, combined with historically low interest rates, gave us the balance sheet to deploy our fiscal firepower to support Canadians through this. If we think back to the 1990s, when Canada's debt needed to be reined in, interest rates were high and public debt was extremely expensive. At that time, our public debt charges were close to 6% of gross domestic product. But now, Canada's debt charges are only around 1% of GDP. And even after all the investments we've made to support Canadians, the cost of servicing our debt is expected to go lower this year. In fact, our total public debt charges for 2020 will actually be $4 billion lower than forecasted last fall. But we, the collective we, will have to face up to our borrowing, ensure that it's sustainable for future generations. Canada's debt structure is prudent. It's spread out over the long term, and it compares well to our G7 peers. And we'll continue to make sure this is the case in the months and years to come as we move toward recovery and as we deal with the aftermath of this unprecedented event. Durant cette crise, sous le leadership du Premier ministre,
Throughout this crisis, under the Prime Minister's leadership, we have been working in coordination with provincial and territorial governments to protect Canadians at a level we have never seen before. Since March, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister have hosted 15 First Ministers' meetings. I have personally taken part in 14 meetings with provincial finance ministers. We have accomplished a lot together, procuring hundreds of millions of pieces of personal protective equipment, making sure that healthcare workers have a secure supply. We have helped to give essential workers a well-deserved raise. It was clear to all of us that our collective actions were going to get us through this.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, Canadians want to get back to work, but they want to do it safely. That's why we are working with provinces and territories on a more than $14 billion Safe Restart agreement We are proposing to invest in a safe, sufficient, and adequate supply of childcare so that parents, especially mothers, don't have to choose between going to work and ensuring their children are taken care of. We also want to build capacity to test and trace and continue to provide world-class healthcare to Canadians. These crucial discussions will be critical to the well-being of Canadians.
Economic recovery will be long and uncertain. Going forward, anything we do must be about growth, resilience, creating opportunity for those who are most impacted by this crisis. We need to invest in an economy that's greener and more diverse, an economy that creates opportunity for young people, for low-income Canadians, for people with disabilities, for women, and that supports our most vulnerable, including LGBTQ2 communities, Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and other racialized people in our country. This pandemic has identified clear gaps, and it's giving us a chance to reset. We witnessed the ways in which people were falling through the cracks, particularly those who live in long-term care. Many of them are our parents and our grandparents who built this country. We need to do better by them. In the coming months, we'll need to come to these problems with dedication, with compassion, and with ingenuity. Mr. Speaker, 80 years ago, Canada faced some of the worst days of the Second World War, and the government faced monumental and difficult choices. In this House, like today, there were those who criticized them for not doing enough, others who said they went too far. But despite the criticisms of the debate, the resolve of Canadians to fearlessly face the emergency of their time never wavered. Today, as we evaluate the details of our measures and the scale of their reach, I want to tell this House that we left no stone unturned. And every decision we made was guided by our belief that the well-being of Canadians had to come above all else. We've worked to lay out an economic response plan that's comprehensive, that's ambitious, and that serves those who need help the most. We've done so in the belief that Canadians would be able to fight the spread of this virus and come roaring back. We've done this to build a bridge to a safer place from which we can build a stronger and more resilient future. Just like in the Second World War, I know that Canadians have what it takes to come together for the greater good. I've seen it in the healthcare workers, 80% of them women, many of them immigrants, who day in and day out put their own health at risk to help others. I've seen it in the businesses that have retooled to build ventilators, masks, gowns, and more. I've seen it in the women and men of the armed forces who've served by caring for our most vulnerable in our long-term care homes. I've seen it in the millions of small donations, small acts of kindness, and the big and small sacrifices Canadians have made to fight this virus. I want to take this moment to send a message to those who have lost loved ones during this time. All of Canada shares in your pain. Canadians are resourceful. Canadians are resilient. Together we'll get through this and build a better, fairer, and stronger Canada. Merci.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, so much of what the Finance Minister just said is not true, but I don't have enough time to enumerate it all because we only have a few minutes for questions and comments. This government was wrong. They were wrong to leave our borders open for longer. They were wrong when they said they were going to have enhanced screening at airports, and they were slow to fix the gaps in their own programs. So many Canadians have been let down by this government. They have refused to fix the wage subsidy. They have refused to remove the back-to-work penalty for people who want to take available shifts, and they have refused to implement the back-to-work bonus that Conservatives have proposed to help people fill available shifts and help local businesses get back on their feet. They have also refused to fund the Auditor General so that she can keep track of this massive amount of new spending, historic levels of deficits and debt. All she wanted was about $10 million to make sure she can go through the programs. But he did find $15 million kicking around for the Deputy Prime Minister's political office. So can the Finance Minister tell this House exactly what the $15 million that he gave the Deputy Prime Minister will be going for, too?
The Honourable Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have, during the course of the last number of months, taken as our very first order of business to support Canadians, to back them up, to create jobs, to help provide a bridge towards the future. But at no time during this period have we forgotten that governing our country is equally important. We have tried to make sure that we could continue to have the government work, to make sure that we could actually deliver for Canadians. One of the biggest challenges we've faced as we've done this is thinking about how we actually deliver to Canadians. When the history of this pandemic is written, I think that history will say that we delivered not only at scale, but at speed. And that's because we not only came up with the right policies, but we found a way to deliver them. What I will say is that our government will continue to make sure that the resources to be able to create that policy, to be able to deliver those results to Canadians is there. And I would say that the Deputy Prime Minister is one of those important people in our government that has helped us to make an enormous difference during this challenging time, and she will continue to do that as an important member of our government.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. Honorable député de La Prairie.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Thank you very much. We've heard that the government made the right spending choices at the right time. At the time, people agreed, but now with this deficit, we're also feeling the effects of that. But what we're really forgetting here is that Quebec and the provinces ultimately ended up having to spend in health costs. They were the ones who were really asked to respond to this exceptional need caused by this unprecedented crisis. Initially, the Liberal government gave money to the provinces with an amount of about $100 million for Quebec. And now we've heard that additional health costs might ultimately total much more than $3 billion. Given that health is an area of provincial jurisdiction and an area of Quebec jurisdiction, and given that the Canadian Constitution means that the federal government has to bear part of the costs of health as that is laid out in the Constitution, given that from 50% it has decreased to 25% and even 20% in health spending, I would like to ask this government what it has done and whether it will make the right efforts to give unconditional monies to the provinces and Quebec to ensure that these provinces and Quebec, to give them a chance to have a little bit of breathing room in this crucial area affected by the pandemic. The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize that it is very important for us to work with the provinces. That is clear, and that includes Quebec. But the numbers are clear. The federal government is the one that has spent $9 out of $10 to directly support Canadians. $212 billion to help people and to reassure them that there will be an economy and jobs after the pandemic. That's a huge amount of money, and we will continue to work with the provinces and work with Quebec on a safe recovery. And that is why we need to continue with debates and discussion. It's very clear. We need to work with the provinces. We will continue to work to support Canadians throughout the country. And the situation with our update today is clear. We have contributed the majority of the support for our country in a very difficult situation. Questions and comments. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Mr. Speaker, and as the Minister knows, I'm a former teacher, so I'd like to give my grades for him on this economic and fiscal snapshot. First, an A for accessibility. There is no doubt that the Finance Minister, though he is working very hard, has been accessible to finance critics and to the Finance Committee every week, and I think that is appreciated and that collaboration is important. Secondly, in terms of expenditures, I would give a passing note of perhaps C+. Now that grade could be higher if supports are given to people with disabilities, the poorest of the poor in this country who've not received a single cent throughout this pandemic, though the banking sector has received $750 billion, $750 billion. People with disabilities should be coming before bankers, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker. And supports for municipalities, supports to changes in the wage subsidy can also bring that grade up. But the grade in terms of revenues is an F, Mr. Speaker. The reality is no action in this economic and fiscal snapshot addresses what is a porous and appallingly unfair tax system. There's no action on tax havens, though that costs us $25 billion a year. There's no action on the wealth tax, though the PBO says that could provide $6 to $9 billion a year, and the increasing concentration of wealth means this must be an imperative. No action on the web giants who are getting away with not paying their fair share of taxes, and nothing that actually addresses the revenue side so we can continue to provide services and enhance services to Canadians. We cannot afford the free ride that so many profitable corporations in Canada have been receiving, and we cannot afford any more this profoundly unfair tax system. So why doesn't this snapshot take action on the revenue side? Why doesn't it take action on tax havens? Why doesn't it take action on a wealth tax? Why doesn't it take action on tax loopholes? This would give a higher grade overall to the Finance Minister.
Honourable Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me first just acknowledge that the critics in all parties in this House and the finance critics have tried to work constructively all the way through this. We've worked to listen to their commentary, just like we've worked to listen to the commentary from business groups, from labour groups across the country. The nature of this pandemic has meant that we have had to act with speed and with scale. It's also meant we've needed to make changes as we've moved along in the delivery of the programs that we're doing to make sure they actually have the desired impact on Canadians. That will be our continued approach as we face up to these challenges. The member, my opposite member, points out something that I think is important. We do believe that it's important for us to recognize that there are some challenges that people with disabilities have faced over the course of the time of the pandemic. And that is something that he's brought up to me on numerous occasions and something that we are certainly trying to work towards. We will continue to think about the ways that we can address this pandemic. We will be focusing right now on the safe restart, working together, we hope, with Canadians across the country, with people in this House, so that we can safely and appropriately get back to work. And that will allow us, we hope, to find a way to ensure that our system works, that we have the appropriate revenues, and that we have a way to move back to an approach where we can invest in the long-term future of Canadians.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. We have about 50 seconds left.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Finance Minister. I echo the comments from my friend from the New Democratic Party finance critic. The Minister has indeed been accessible. I have a very specific question. I mean, this document is a snapshot. I know that if you have a crystal ball, it's pretty murky right now. We can't see very far ahead. But I do wonder how it is that we've referred at page 20 of this document to the payment to people with disabilities as though it has happened. We know it has not.
The Honourable Finance Minister.
I want to thank the member for her question. What we are demonstrating with this document is all of the policies that we've put forward that we are working to actually deliver on for Canadians. We recognize that there's things that we don't know, so there will be future actions that we will likely have to take because this pandemic is dynamic. But we did recognize in this House the importance of dealing with people with disabilities, and we certainly hope that we will find support in this House for moving forward with that support.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I will be sharing my time with the honourable member for Carleton, one of the great hard-working finance shadow ministers that the minister referenced, was doing so much good work to try to help fix the gaps in the government's programs. Mr. Speaker, the finance minister has just painted an extremely dire picture of Canada's finances. But what we didn't hear was any kind of a plan to support the reopening of our economy and to get Canadians back to work. Coming out of the pandemic, every single country on the planet will be desperately competing for the same opportunities and the same investments. So where is the Prime Minister's plan to set us apart? The United Kingdom has a plan. France, Germany, South Korea, Japan, they all have plans. In fact, every single country in the G7 has a plan. Le gouvernement emprunte 3.
The government is borrowing $343 billion this year, but the Prime Minister has no plan whatsoever to help Canadians return to work, no plan to guide our economic recovery, no plan to stimulate growth, attract business investment, or create the conditions for job growth.
The government is borrowing $343 billion this year. For the first time ever, this year, the net federal debt will reach over $1 trillion. In fact, they're borrowing so much money, Mr. Speaker, that the Bank of Canada has to create it out of thin air. The Bank of Canada is purchasing $5 billion worth of government debt every single week. The Prime Minister has absolutely no plan to help Canadians return to work, no plan to guide our economic recovery, no plan to stimulate growth, attract business investment, or to create the conditions for job growth. I know this might come as a shock to a Liberal Prime Minister, but spending billions of dollars does not create economic growth. And handing it out to Liberal insiders certainly won't restart our economy. More Liberal tax hikes, more red tape won't restart our economy. Pour être concurrentiel, nous devons...
To remain competitive, we have to free the power of the private sector, help Canadians go back to work, support small businesses, cut taxes, eliminate red tape, and make Canada an attractive place to do business again.
Conception right now on the economy is that if we simply lift the restrictions and provinces reopen, our economy will come roaring back to life. The reality is it will take leadership, big ideas, and a lot of hard work. But the Prime Minister's track record proves that he cannot be trusted to lead Canada's recovery. His sky-high taxes, wasteful spending, and massive deficits put Canada in an incredibly weak position before the pandemic began. While a responsible government would have saved while times were good and paid down debt, as our previous Conservative government did, the Liberals added $87 billion worth of new debt during their first 4 years of power. As a result, Canada is the only G7 country to have lost its AAA credit rating and has one of the highest debt levels in the AA category. Before the pandemic, Canada's unemployment rate was higher than all G7 countries, except France and Italy, whose socialist policies the Prime Minister was trying to emulate. Now Canada has surpassed them and has the highest unemployment rate in the G7. In fact, we have among the highest unemployment rates in the OECD, falling fourth, right behind Greece. So this should be a major wake-up call for this government. C'est sûr que les Canadiens luttent.
Canadians are struggling. The last months have been truly difficult. Millions of people have lost their jobs. More than 100,000 Canadians are ill and thousands have died. Businesses have closed and many of them will never reopen. Canadians have been horrified to see their savings disappear.
Despite all of this, as provinces gradually reopen, Canadians are hopeful and optimistic about their futures. They want to work. Businesses want to reopen, to welcome back staff and customers. They are determined to rebuild and are coming up with innovative ways to offer services as provinces. Now, I don't know why the Prime Minister always feels the need to talk down Canada, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are an endlessly enterprising people. Perhaps it's a product of our immigrant society where people leave the familiarity of home for a shot at a better life on the other side of the world and then work hard to achieve it. Perhaps it's the inspiration we take from Indigenous peoples, resilient men and women who built Canada's first communities in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Perhaps it's our belief in freedom, limited government, and the power of the free market. Regardless of the reason, Canadians have proven time and time again that through hard work, innovation, and perseverance, we can accomplish anything. Mr. Speaker, Canada's economic recovery will be driven by Canadians. Governments don't create jobs, and you can't borrow your way to prosperity. True success comes from investing in people. But the only people that the Liberals are interested in investing in are the wealthy elites. While regular Canadians continue to struggle, the Prime Minister is passing buckets of money around the highest levels of corporate Canada. It started in the last Parliament when they developed their superclusters program, handing out billions and billions of dollars to corporate entities and wealthy institutions. They gave $50 million to MasterCard, $12 million for Loblaws. They gave $35 billion to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, which protects wealthy investors and puts all the risk on the backs of taxpayers. And how many projects has that new infrastructure bank actually completed? 0. Wow. And the Bank of Canada, as I said earlier, is printing money. Now, the Finance Minister just bragged about the low cost of servicing that debt. Well, there's a reason why, Mr. Speaker. It's because the Bank of Canada is purchasing government debt on the secondary bond market. So they are creating money out of thin air. And who gets that money first? Wealthy investors who already purchased government debt in the past. Mr. Speaker, this is the epitome of trickle-down economics. Throwing money around at the highest levels of corporate Canada while raising taxes on hard-working Canadians. In the middle of a pandemic and all the economic difficulty that this pandemic has caused, they raised the carbon tax, raising payroll taxes, and raising excise taxes. Meanwhile, no help for energy workers. They refused to fix their flawed programs. The Finance Minister talked about the need for speed. Well, we all agreed back in March that the government had to act quickly. And we were told that if Parliament passed these measures, that they would be fixed as time went on. I note the date, Mr. Speaker. It's the 8th of July. They still have not fixed the flaws in the wage subsidy. There are still thousands and thousands of people who have lost their jobs because of the gaps in that program. They refuse to make any adjustments on the rental subsidies, requiring businesses to have lost 70% of revenue before they qualify. And of course, they refuse to take away the barrier to people returning back to work by adopting the back to work bonus that the Conservatives have proposed. And we can't forget that in the middle of this pandemic, this Prime Minister has let so many Canadians fall behind. Depuis le début de la pandémie.
From the beginning of the pandemic, the Conservatives have presented constructive solutions to help Canadians. Our goal is to help workers and local businesses get back on their feet as quickly as possible. It was very disappointing when the Prime Minister did not use the economic profile offered today to include the back-to-work bonus, which is part of the Conservative plan to make the Canada Emergency Response benefit more flexible and generous for workers to earn while businesses gradually reopen.
To our recovery. A good job helps Canadians succeed. It helps their families succeed. It helps build our communities and ultimately makes our country stronger. Under this Prime Minister, Canada and Canadians are losing out. We're falling behind. We're falling behind every other nation in the G7. That is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Canadians deserve a government that stands up for their interests. They deserve better than what they just got today.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I see a totally different picture than the one that the Leader of the Official Opposition has just portrayed. I see a government that has been demonstrating caring, compassion, a government that has worked with other levels of government of all political stripes to make sure that Canadians in all regions of our great nation are being looked after, that they are in fact the #1 priority of this government, of this cabinet, and this Prime Minister. That is what I have witnessed. We have seen programs come from virtually nowhere, not being of non-existence, programs like CERB, to serving millions of Canadians, providing the disposable income that is so critical for them to be able to buy the things that are necessary, Madam Speaker. I have seen businesses that have been saved to the degree in which millions of jobs have been saved as a direct response. I have seen opposition members come to the table in a positive way to contribute to making life better for all Canadians. This is a government that truly cares and has the compassion and has put Canadians first and foremost as the #1 priority. My question to the member opposite, would he not agree that it is time that we look and focus on what's in the best interest of the families of Canada and get behind programs like providing more support for Canadians with disabilities?
Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I'm not surprised the member has selective memory when it comes to the last few months. It seems like he's stuck in March. He's stuck, I think it was about March 22nd, when everybody realized that we were in an unprecedented situation. And we all agreed that we would come back to Parliament to give the government the tools they needed to help Canadians. And what did his party do with that opportunity? Before members of Parliament had even gathered in this chamber, before we had even figured out how to stay 6 feet apart, 2 meters, this government wrote themselves a massive power grab, trying to eliminate the role of Parliament. In the middle of a pandemic, when people were losing their jobs and losing loved ones, the first thought this party had was, how can we benefit politically from it? And then when we pointed out time and time again the gaps that people were falling through the wage subsidy, through the CERB and the penalty for going back to work, the rental subsidy, they have refused to make any of those changes, leaving thousands of Canadians behind. That is the legacy that this government will take into the next election, and I have no doubt that Canadians will not reward them for their slowness, their poor decisions, and their inaction.
L'honorable député de la Prairie, questions and comments.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you. The Bloc Québécois had proposed modulating CERB. Regardless of the amount or hours worked, one would always have an increase as one worked. It seemed evident. We asked the government to act. And the Deputy Prime Minister had accepted looking into it and had committed to implementing it. At the time, the Conservatives had remained silent about that. And a few weeks ago, we saw them present the idea that, yes, modulating CERB was a good idea. Why is it a good idea? Because that way we encourage people to go back to work. That means it's not a break to growth. It would be easier if CERB encouraged people to go back to work. That's what the government of Quebec keeps telling us. On the other hand, if people go back to work, it's easy to understand. It's less expensive in terms of paying out CERB. Everyone wins. Government revenue increases because growth is stronger, and government expenditures diminish because people are going back to work and everybody's happy. That way, we have a situation where we improve the outcome for our communities. The Conservative Party has seen the light and is on our side. Does the leader of the official opposition think that if we had modulated the CERB from the very beginning? I'm sorry, we have 5 minutes for questions and comments. We need to give the opportunity for an answer, but I need to include 3 minutes in a 5-minute time period, and that doesn't give other parties time. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Premièrement, Madame la Présidente.
First of all, Madam Speaker, the Conservatives support the idea of eliminating barriers to people who want to go back to work. And it's a compliment that the Bloc Québécois has given to the Conservative, that they stole our idea. It is a great compliment. Our party had proposed the idea of providing incentives for Canadians to go back to work. Our shadow Minister of Finance had proposed that idea. It is thanks to the very hard work of our Conservative team that moved forward ideas to improve the disastrous programs, depending on some situations, of the Liberal government. If the Bloc Québécois has seen the light and is supporting our position, that's a good thing, Madam Chair.
Once again, I just want to remind that there's 5 minutes for questions and comments. We're going to try to get 3 questions in. Unfortunately, there's not enough time, and I would remind members to keep their questions short enough so that we can allow others to ask questions. The honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. What we witnessed today was, for the first time in history, something a government called a fiscal and economic snapshot. A snapshot is defined in most dictionaries as sort of a quick photograph, or in modern lingo we call it a selfie, an economic selfie. But this finance minister, in talking for about 15 minutes straight, could not bring himself to utter the size of the debt or the deficit. Now, I will be the first, apparently, to do so. I ask all members to ensure they are in their seats, and that they, if anyone out there is listening to this speech while operating heavy equipment, you might want to turn the volume down. This government has now smashed through the $1 trillion debt mark. $1.06 trillion is the size of Canada's national debt. A deficit of $343 billion. To put that into perspective, when this government took office, the entire budget of the Government of Canada was about $260 billion. In other words, they are borrowing more in 1 year than the Government of Canada used to spend in its entire budget not long ago. Now, the finance minister went to great lengths to brag about the low interest rates that he's paying on the debt, as though he somehow set those interest rates himself, which raises questions about his perception of the Bank of Canada's independence. But what he forgets is that those interest rates are temporary, and they're only made possible by the cornucopia of cash that is coming out of the Bank of Canada, a bank which has created through keystrokes on a computer about $400 billion of new currency for government spending in less than 100 days. In other words, that's almost equal to a full quarter of GDP created out of thin air by our central bank. Now, the Prime Minister thinks he's discovered a new idea in creating currency in order to spend it. He best look back to history to know that this method of financing state activity can only go on for so long. I raise all of this not because the programs to support Canadians and replace the wages that governments have taken away from them are unnecessary. They are very necessary, of course, when government deprives people through lockdowns and shutdowns of their ability to earn an income. It is the government's job to compensate them for that, and such measures have been necessary and generally, with exception, supported by the official opposition. That said, we know that no nation can go on consuming without producing. The only way for us to continue to exist economically is to once again unleash the full and incomparable power of Canada's 20 million person workforce. Hear, hear. To let free the more than 1 million entrepreneurs and businesses that employ those workers. And that should have been the purpose of today's address, instead of a temporary moment of self-congratulation combined with hypnotic phrases intended to make us feel comfortable with $1 trillion of debt. We expected the finance minister would arrive here today with a plan to bring our economy back to life. Instead, what he did is brag that his plan is the most expensive plan in the G7. He said, because it consumes 10% of GDP, higher than any other G7 country and higher than the G20 average, because it spends the most money, because it is the most costly, it must therefore be the best. But of course, it has simultaneously produced the worst results. Canada now has the highest unemployment in the G7. We went into the crisis with the highest, save France and Italy, whose socialist policies this government had long been trying to emulate. But now, only 100 days later, our economic position is even worse than theirs, even worse than Italy, which bore among the hardest brunt of the COVID crisis. Today, Canada has the worst job record and posture in all of the G7. In other words, they have spent the most to achieve the least. And the only thing they had today for job creation was a new $15 million fund to staff up the Deputy Prime Minister's office. $15 million. I guess that's enough to create 150 six-figure jobs for political staffers working now for the Deputy Prime Minister. It's funny. The Auditor General asked for $11 million so that she could do her job examining all of this spending. You know, today the Auditor General is doing about 14 audits a year. 10 years ago, the Auditor General's office did 28 audits a year, twice as many. Government spending today is over $600 billion. Back then, it was about $250 billion. In other words, spending is up by more than double, and the number of audits are down by half, which means we have a quarter of the accountability. So today, we would just assumed that in this massive spending splurge, they would find $10 or $11 million for the Auditor General. Compared to the other spending they're doing, it's not very much. In fact, this government is now spending almost exactly $1 million per minute. So in the time I give my speech, they could have fully funded the Auditor General. But they did not have money for the Auditor General. They had $15 million for the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, I'm sure that later today, when I move a motion in the House of Commons, that we will shift that $15 million from the Deputy Prime Minister to the Auditor General. We will have no problem getting unanimous consent. I'm looking around and I see violent agreement from all sides of the House of Commons, and I'm sure that it will be a mere perfunctory matter of procedure to get it done when I move my motion later on. But it is interesting that this government's only job creation measure in today's presentation was in the Deputy Prime Minister's office. So what could we do as an alternative? Well, we as Conservatives are proposing to transform the COVID programs into pro-growth, pro-job initiatives. Let's go through the list. The wage subsidy. We believed, in fact, we supported a generous wage subsidy in order to keep our workers active and contributing as much as possible during the shutdown and in the subsequent reopening. Unfortunately, though, you have to be down 30% in order to qualify for that wage subsidy. That is forcing many businesses to artificially suppress their revenues in order to continue to qualify for the subsidy. That is because their extra revenue is not as big as the wage subsidy itself. So the government is arbitrarily forcing businesses to suppress their own revenues just to stay alive. A more perverse incentive could not have been invented. And if there were such an incentive, it would be the rent subsidy, which requires revenues be down 70%. Again, the instant that business rises above that threshold, they lose the ability to pay their rent. We as Conservatives, have, under the leadership of our small business critic from Edmonton, have proposed that businesses be able to gently phase out their need for assistance by increasing their revenues and slowly decreasing their wage subsidy at the same time. Secondly, you have the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, a necessary measure, no doubt, But if this government has imposed a back-to-work penalty. If people earn more than $1,000, the Prime Minister will kick them from the CERB to the curb. We in the Conservative Party believe that we should reward work, to allow people a back-to-work bonus that will ensure that every dollar they earn, every shift they take, will make them better off than they were before. Canadians believe in work, and their government should always reward work. And that's why Conservatives have come forward with a pro-work, pro-growth agenda. We call on this government to embrace growth and jobs, to once again unleash the ferocious power of our workers and our entrepreneurs to bring our economy back to life, our finances under control, and our nation on solid footing. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And, you know, I think what we have seen over the last number of months is a government that's taken a different approach from the Conservatives, and I see that as a good thing. We have looked at many programs that the member opposite just made reference to, whether it's the CERB program, wage loss program. We've also been able to provide direct support to families through childcare, to seniors, whether it's through the GIS, the OAS, supporting Canadians in this difficult time of the pandemic ultimately allows us to be able to be on a road to recovery in a much better form. Would the member not agree, and maybe hopefully we can get an agreement on this, that the time for government to have invested in the way in which we have was in fact at the time in which we did, and as a direct result we will be on a better path to recovery?
Honourable Member for Carleton.
Est-ce que je m'entends avec les...
Do I agree with the statement of my honourable colleague? Well, the figures don't agree with it because we have the highest unemployment rate in the G7. It's true the Liberal government has spent more in terms of our percentage of GDP than other countries, but the results are the highest unemployment rate amongst other competitive countries. So, no, this is not a success, and this is why we're proposing to change these programs for the rent subsidy, for the wage subsidy, and personal income supports in a way that will reimburse and pay for people to go back to work and encourage growth rather than hampering it. As Canadians, it's not just an economic issue, it's a question of values. We always have to encourage and pay. It has to pay to work rather than be penalized. The Honourable Member for Joliette. I'd like to ask my colleague what he thinks about the following. We heard through the media that there were cases of fraud in the CERB, people who fraudulently benefited from this program, and the government announced that it would investigate this and get this money back. Because does my colleague, can he provide what action is going to be taken to fight this in today's update? I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question. I agree with what he's saying. On the Finance Committee, we adopted a motion so that the Auditor General would receive the funding to do an audit. And we know that even when public servants saw there was a potential fraud, the government said to send out the check. We were people in prison who received these checks. And this is exactly why the Auditor General should receive all the necessary funding so that she can investigate this spending and ensure that fraud did not account for a large portion of this money.
Kona.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the member for Carleton for his comments and flagging some of those issues that have been very important to people in my riding of Edmonton Strathcona. Seeing how accommodating and friendly the Conservatives in the Bloc are today and how happy they are to get along, I guess. My question is around whether or not the Conservatives, instead of cutting services that Canadian families rely upon, Would the Conservatives support our call for wealth on tax of the super rich that would raise $6 billion a year, and cracking down on the estimated $25 billion in corporate taxes we are losing to tax havens each year?
The honourable member for Carleton.
Well, of course, we support cracking down on tax havens. Everyone should pay what they owe, and anyone who's breaking the law to avoid doing so should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The NDP is fond of coming up with other schemes they claim will raise revenue. They never actually do in practice. But what we would propose, if you want to stop handing money to the rich, let's stop the corporate welfare schemes that use taxpayers' money to fill the pockets of wealthy and influential people. Let's cancel the $35 billion infrastructure bank, which is nothing more than a backstop of profits for large construction and private equity firms. Let's cancel handouts to firms like Loblaws, MasterCard, Bombardier, and others.
Unfortunately, the time is up.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Joliette. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
A point of privilege. The honourable member for Thompson Caribou.
Madam Speaker, I will make this quick. I didn't mean to interrupt my Bloc colleague, so I do apologize. But I noticed many people in the chamber, in committee, have a document. And I would presume the document is a fiscal update, which is allowing them to ask the questions and see the details, which of course weren't in the minister's statement, such items as the deficit numbers. Then I went looking into my emails thinking surely they would care about the couple of hundred plus that are not in the chamber and have distributed that document to us. So again, that we could clearly see what was happening and be on an equal playing field in our opportunity to ask questions. So, Madam Speaker, I truly feel as a virtual committee member today, not having been provided that document, that my privileges have been violated. Thank you.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader has a point of order.
Yeah, just to address the concern, I think that the member raises a valid point, and that is to say that everything was shared with all parties under embargo earlier today, and that included electronic copies from what I understand. So members all do have access to it. How the respective caucuses and independents received it, I'm not 100% sure, but I do believe that the information was made available.
So it is a question that was raised a little bit earlier as well. So it is, as the Parliamentary Secretary has just mentioned, is that the document was shared with the party leaders, and I would anticipate that the parties are distributing that to, or have distributed to its members. I know that the document is public, and therefore we will continue on. I will get a double check on where the document is at with the other parties at this point, whether or not they have actually distributed it. Resuming a point of order, the honourable member for Carleton.
I believe if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent for the following motion, Madam Speaker. Whereas the fiscal snapshot identifies, quote, increased capacity at the Privy Council office. This measure would increase the capacity of the Privy Council office to ensure that it can continue to meet its mandate following the creation of the role of Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs and International Trade in the amount of $7 million next year and $15 million for each year after that. The House calls on the government to transfer this full sum from the Office of the Privy Council to the Office of the Auditor General. Thank you.
As was mentioned earlier today, we are doing things a little bit different because of the format that we are in, and therefore, at this point, I'm going to be asking all those opposed to the Honourable our members moving the motion will please say nay. Nay. And I would ask anybody virtually if anybody virtually is saying no, then if they can raise the hand on their virtual screen, that would be of assistance. So so the honourable member knows that you have to have a unanimous consent, and there is no unanimous consent. Okay. C'est bon? J'ai bien fait ça. Alors, j'étais où, là? Joliette, reprise de débat.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We've been asking for this update since May, along with the other opposition parties and with the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and finally it's here today. And once again, the government chose to inform the financial sector first before this House. It was Bloomberg, in fact, that announced the news first. And quite frankly, Madam Chair, the Bloc Québécois didn't have very high expectations for today's snapshot, but the economic snapshot presented did manage to disappoint us. In fact, the document lists the measures announced and the total impact on our finances, and it kind of stops there. The Bloc made several requests with respect to this update. First, it wanted a $14 billion transfer to the provinces without conditions, and that's not in here. There's a question of the $40 billion, but the conditions are still in place. We also want to see a tweak to the CERB to encourage workers to return to their jobs, and this isn't here either. And we want to see a change in the wage subsidy to include seasonal industries such as tourism and culture, and this isn't here either. And when we read the economic snapshot, you'd think we were still back in April, but it's July now. Businesses have started to reopen. We're at the beginning of an economic recovery, and now is the time to modify these programs. The economic snapshot was a golden opportunity today to usher in change. For example, the CERB. For me, this is first and foremost a public health measure. We're asking people not to go to work and stay home. In exchange, the government pays them $2,000 a month. But as businesses are reopening and the government has to change its message, it is high time to revise this benefit. And right now, workers still, if they earn $1 more than the $1,000 a month they're allowed to earn, they lose everything. And at a time when we want to restart the economy and we want companies to reopen, the message they're sending is that if you earn $1 more, you're going to lose your entire benefit. It doesn't make sense. And this creates the following situation. With an unemployment rate that is still very high, of around 12%, this means many people could work, of course, with all the measures, necessary health measures in place. And what are the chambers of commerce telling us? They're having a hard time finding employees. Why? Because this government still hasn't amended the CERB. And the message that the government is sending is that while it's telling workers to stay at home like it did in April, it doesn't make sense. Yet, we've been asking, well, early, the leader of the Conservative Party, said that he was the first person to announce this, but regardless, well, when it's a good idea, we have to spread it. But we've been asking for these changes since March. And what we want is the same principle of the one that's in place for unemployment insurance. When you earn more than $1,000, there's a sliding scale, so you don't lose everything. So you can keep 50 cents for every dollar you earn over the $1,000 a month. For almost 4 months, for almost 4 months now, the government is telling us that it's been too complicated. This excuse may work for a week or two, but now it's been 4 months. It's just too long. It's not working. And it's the same thing for the wage subsidy. The government has to amend it. So we don't have a 30% cutoff rate. If you lose 29% of your income, you get nothing. Well, we understood in the first few weeks it was an emergency. We had to act quickly. But now, it's been several months now, and it's high time for things to change. We have to improve these measures. We also have to modify the wage subsidy to allow seasonal sectors such as tourism and culture to be eligible for it. The solution is quite simple, and it's so simple that the government has already presented it a month ago. It presented this solution a month ago and still hasn't implemented it, namely to pay this subsidy based on last year's salaries rather than the income in February, when seasonal companies were closed. So this was in Bill C-17 that was tabled a month ago, but wasn't adopted. So why wasn't C-17 adopted? Because the government decided to turn its nose up to it. Either the House adopted it word for word as it was, or the government wouldn't present it. So we had no right to amend it or to debate it. So it was either take it or leave it. And we have a minority government that's trying to play the role of a dictator. Doesn't make sense. That's just a small side personal note. And this is what happens when we talk about what country you admire and they say China. Well, it may tempt people to act like a dictator. So, Madam Speaker, we're still waiting for the government to make these amendments to the wage subsidy, and including a modification for Airbus that also wants to have access to this benefit, even though there is public funding invested in this project. We know that the aerospace industry is having a hard time right now, and we have to change this.
Madam Speaker, let me just remind you that at a time when large swathes of our economy don't have access to the wage subsidy, somehow the Liberal Party has both its hands in the cookie jar. Well, the pandemic is really having to pay for a lot of things here. We're in a terrible ethical dilemma. The Liberal Party thinks that it has the right to take as much money as it wants from the wage subsidy, and yet it's dragging its feet when it comes to large sectors of our economy. It's a crying shame, and it must change. The government, and this is contradictory, didn't get Bill C-17 passed, and yet somehow the snapshot we saw today somehow counted it in its financial assessments. Isn't it time to debate C-17? As my colleague for Saanich Gulf Islands from the Green Party said earlier, assistance for people with disabilities is enumerated here. We know that that group has been majorly affected by the pandemic, as the government recognizes in the document. So, Madam Speaker, my question to the government, when is the government going to table this so we can debate it? We have the right to do that. That's our job. We need to get this passed. We've been waiting for that for a month. Another thing, and this comes up all the time, is about the overpayments of assistance. There have been cases of fraud. The government said it was going to try to recover these sums, but there's not a single line about that in today's economic snapshot. Let me just add an anecdote here. It's quite striking. Let me tell you, during the technical briefing that the government offered to the opposition parties earlier, I asked a question on this topic. Then there was a silence. And in the background, I heard someone say, "What the fudge?" That was the answer that I got to my question on this. I think you'll all agree that that's not the answer of the century. This isn't a joking matter. Perhaps they were surprised to realize that they hadn't mentioned it. It's another missed opportunity. Now we're learning here, as we expected, that there's a huge $343 billion deficit only up until now. That's the bill that's going to come due next March. But only if there isn't a second wave, if there's nothing else added in terms of measures. That's a minimum then. That's where we are today. It's extremely worrisome. Currently, what we're being told by the government, this is surprising but intriguing, something we've learned, is that debt servicing has actually decreased because interest rates have gone down thanks to massive support from the Bank of Canada, and central banks elsewhere in the world have done something similar. So, in the short term, and hopefully in the long term, because we're talking here about obligations that will spread over decades, but it does decrease the interest to pay. Like for other countries in the G7 and G20, the government has taken on a huge burden of debt to support the economy during the pandemic. That was the least bad of several bad outcomes. Such a deficit can be justified if it were used to make good spending choices. That's what we want, good spending choices. And I would just like to remind here, transferring $14 billion unconditionally to provinces, that would be a good idea. Modifying the emergency benefit to include work incentives, that would be a good idea. The government should take action here as soon as possible. We expected to see that in today's document. Broaden the wage subsidy so it applies to seasonal sectors like tourism and culture. And what has the government done? Well, it's taken on debt, in many cases a very long-term debt, 10 to 30%, 10 to 30 years rather, but we're not hearing about an increase in revenues because the government isn't going to do anything to reduce tax evasion and avoidance. And it's not doing more to tax web giants to make sure that they pay their fair share of taxes and royalties. The government's message today is clear. These giants, banks, and multinational companies that are not paying their taxes will continue to get away with not paying their taxes. And yet, we're having a record level of debt here, but it doesn't seem to change anything about the government's approach. This is serious, and we're going to continue pressuring the government to change it. In the economic projections here, the government is basing itself on private sector predictions, which state that there will be an activity decrease of 6.8% this year, and an increase of 5.5% compensating for that in 2021. But if you look at it year over year, at the end of 2021, we still won't be back to the pre-COVID level of activity. It's what economists call an inverted or a backward square root sign, because like the mirror image of a square root, things go down and then they come up again, but not as far. Given that this is the case, the government should have reduced uncertainty to a maximum by announcing today changes to their assistance programs and announcing that they were going to be extended over a longer period for economic sectors that need support and that are going to be struggling for longer, like aerospace or culture, for example. In its economic snapshot, the government recognizes what we're hearing from businesses. The rent support program is not working. It is too restrictive. How many requests have been made for this program throughout Canada? You may be wondering, 29,000. If you compare that to the emergency loan of 40,000, there are 700,000 nearly requests there. So it's only 25 times fewer applications. it's clear that this is not working. It needs to be modified and reviewed because it doesn't make no sense that that program has 25 times fewer requests. I see you agree with me, Madam Speaker. Now, with health costs that are skyrocketing, there is an extremely high bill for Quebec and the provinces. And this $14 billion that has been announced will only cover a part of the new costs. The conditions that are being imposed here aren't doing anything except further centralizing the power with the federal government and undermining provincial powers. Before the pandemic, the health system was already underfinanced. The parliamentary budget officer stated this clearly. Ottawa is the one that has leeway in this area. Even if significant expenditures are made by Quebec and the provinces, there hasn't been a single transfer or percent of taxes from the federal government to the provinces since 1964, Lester B. Pearson in 1964. These are important sectors: health, social services, education. The government is negotiating agreements on a case-by-case basis. It is interfering with areas of provincial jurisdiction, it's reducing transfers and increasing conditions and interference. That needs to stop. It's not working. Our public services are being smothered, and Ottawa is not doing enough to help them. They're struggling. Meanwhile, Ottawa is simply increasing centralization. We need this to stop, and I need to repeat what we're asking the government. A good start would be to transfer the $14 billion without conditions. That would at least be a good start. And that's my speech. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to my colleagues' questions. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de Argenteuil-la-Petite.
The honourable member for Argenteuil-la-Petite-Nation. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. My colleague is sketching a portrait of a pandemic that's practically over, that we can go back to normal, that we can start changing these programs. And yet my colleague across the way should know that changing each of these programs would be very difficult for the government in a crisis like this one. We've been modifying programs from week to week. He's making it sound like we're telling people to stay home, don't go back to work, and just take advantage of the money. That's not what we're doing in my riding. In my riding, we're telling people to go back to work. People aren't going to give up a year, or rather, they're not going to give up a permanent job in order to just take advantage of a 1-month benefit. So I would say that changing the eligibility criteria for this would ultimately have made everything more cumbersome and wouldn't have met our goals. The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We're asking for these programs to be better tailored. It's all very well to say it's too complicated. That was more convincing during the first couple of weeks of the program, but now it's no good anymore. My colleague from Argenteuil-la-Petite-Nation, which is a beautiful part of Quebec, by the way, and it's worth visiting it, he doesn't seem to have understood my speech. We're asking the government to modify these programs in order to increase incentives to go back to work. We're criticizing the government for what it's doing currently. It's ultimately disincentivizing going back to work. And we're not done with this pandemic. There may even be a second wave. And in this document tabled today, it says that there's a lot of concerns about a second wave. Okay. But there's nothing specific there. And then when we look at the budget announced, there's no contingency fund, there's no plan B here. If there were an emergency fund for a second wave, well, that would be a lot better. So, frankly, I would ask my colleague to reread his colleague's own document. Questions and comments? The honourable member from Montmagny-Lizy, Camarasa, Rivière-du-Loup. I have a question for my colleague. It's not a matter of squabbling over who proposed something first between us and the Bloc Québécois. The idea is to put forward proposals to this government to allow employees to get back to work. So I would like to congratulate members of the Bloc who are collaborating with us on this in order to move things forward, because we're still in the thick of this pandemic, as everyone knows. But what we've heard today, $343 billion, that doesn't include future recovery funds, and I would like to ask my colleague to tell us how he feels about that. The honourable member for Joliette. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. We're talking here about $343 billion. Now, it's not going to need to be reimbursed right away, but that's just the minimum. I'm pretty sure I'd be willing to bet on this that there's going to be more than that by the end of the fiscal year. Because that makes it sound like between today and next March that the government's not going to spend another red cent. What's going to happen if there's a second wave? What's going to happen then? We're going to need more recovery measures. Look at the important sectors that are struggling. And the green economy, for example. I'm sure my colleague agrees with this. We need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. That would be an investment in the economy of tomorrow. I see my colleague nodding. Listen, we're choosing here to try to find the lesser of multiple evils, and if this money can be used to stimulate the economy and set it back on a firm foundation, I say we should go for it. But things need to be done right, and we're going to get them next time. Our colleagues from the other party. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I do greatly appreciate my colleague. He's wonderful on the Finance Committee. Now, we've heard a lot about the lack of revenues for this government, and once again, we see that there's no action. There's no action on tax havens. There's nothing here about tax loopholes. There's no action to tax web giants. There's nothing here. And yet, if the government had taken action on these points, we could have created some more leeway to help people. Does my colleague agree that we need to find new ways for the government to raise income and create a fair tax system in order to help all Canadians? The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I totally agree with my colleague. Indeed, it's completely unacceptable to have a tax system here. A tax system where the strongest, the richest, the most well-heeled among us end up doing less to support the economy than the middle class and the most vulnerable among us. We're seeing a government here that's doing more to support the Sheriff of Nottingham than trying to emulate Robin Hood. I've been fighting since 2015 for a more fair system so that we can limit the use of tax havens. This is unacceptable. It's immoral, and in many cases, it's illegal. Here with the pandemic, we're incurring immense amounts of spending, $343 million in deficit, and yet somehow nothing is being done to cut in on these profiteering large companies. We should change that now. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Salaberry-sur-Loire. I'd like to thank my colleague for Joliette. He's very sensitive to the difficulties experienced by people living with a disability, people who day after day have to adapt to the difficulties of everyday life. I understand. I'm glad that he understands that. The Bloc had proposed that today the government could have tabled part of Bill C-17 that would discuss specifically the financial assistance offered to people living with a disability. I would like to ask my colleague for Joliette. Does he feel at all better after reading this economic snapshot? Does he really think that the government will finally show more understanding for the situation of people living with a disability and offer them financial assistance? The honourable member for Joliette. I'd like to thank my colleague for Salaberry-sur-Loire, not only for her question, but for the level of empathy she shows for people living with a disability. I am not at all reassured after reading this document. Not at all. Why? Because this should have been adopted a month ago. It should have been tabled in the House, debated, amended if necessary, and adopted. There was broad consensus in the House to go ahead with that measure. And yet, what did the government do? the government said, well, we don't want any amendment to our bill. Take it or leave it. This is a minority government. That's not how things work. I am by no means reassured about this. Today, the government could have corrected things. It could have tabled a part of that bill. It didn't do it. When is it going to do it? Who knows? But even if it had done it today, that would have been too late. Questions and comments?
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Joliette. I'd like to ask him, what does he think of having a guaranteed minimum income system? We've seen that with CERB, there may be a disincentive for those who wish to go back to work, but with a guaranteed minimum income program, well, that's in no way a disincentive, because people can decide to go to work even if they're getting the basic income to allow them to have the basic necessities of life. The honourable member for Joliette. Well, if I understand it correctly, this is a very interesting debate about the guaranteed minimum income. However, in the current framework of our federation, many support measures for social services are an area of provincial and Quebec jurisdiction. Ottawa has provided some of that support, but putting in place the guaranteed minimum income would mean that there would need to be an agreement between Ottawa and the provinces. And as we can see, when it comes to health, social housing, infrastructure, Ottawa provides part of the funding, but it takes years before coming up with an agreement. Ottawa puts all sorts of conditions on the money. We're still waiting for the social housing transfer. We've been waiting for that for 2 years since it was signed. We were sure that it would all be settled before the election campaign more than a year ago. And so, unfortunately, I would say, Madam Speaker, that in Quebec, the best way to get a guaranteed minimum income would be to first become independent.
We have a point of order. The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Island, Rideau Lakes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the point raised by the member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou, two things very quickly that I'd like to bring to your attention, Madam Speaker, and that is, one, that an embargoed copy of the document was provided to the Office of the Leader of the Official Opposition. However, it is not the custom or the expectation that bootlegged copies are made of these documents and then distributed to members of recognized parties in the House. The second item is that the custom is that the government distributes documents to members and that they don't seek them out or, again, seek those out from the offices of the recognized parties in this place, and that it is the government that is responsible to provide documents that are presented in the House to all members. The privilege that members have is not given to them through parties or run through the parties. It is run through this House, and that is the point raised by that member, and it's not a judgment to be made on the inaction or action of distribution by those offices of the leaders, but instead by the government's responsibility to provide that information to all members of this place, whether they're participating virtually or in the House. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
So again, I will try to answer this to the best of my ability. Obviously, we are working into a very different format at this point in time, and I think we're all learning from this as well. I certainly agree that any documentation provided by the government should be, all members should be privy to that. However, the declaration that was made today, I'm struggling at this point with the format of it, but the government has indicated that that document was provided to the House leaders and to the leader, and therefore those documents should have been at some point distributed to make sure that all members. So no doubt that every member should have been privy to the document. How that was distributed, I think that we will learn from this experience. I will raise this with the Speaker, and I'm sure that the Speaker will add to it in some form, whether directly to the parties or to come back to the House to address that. And therefore, it was a different format than what is normally seen during budgets. And so it wasn't actually a tabling of a budget. And therefore, again, I will leave it to the Speaker to come back should he need to respond to that directly in the House or to the parties. Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'll be sharing my time with the very honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby. Madam Speaker, throughout this pandemic, we've been focused on people. We knew that the pandemic's impact on people would be that people would not be able to pay their bills, they would be having trouble and struggles putting food on the table. And so everything we've done in this pandemic has been to push the government to deliver more help to more people. We knew in the beginning that EI would not cover enough Canadians. We know that EI only applies to 40% of Canadians, so we needed to do more than that we needed to push the government to do more than just expanding EI. And so we pushed the government to create CERB and have the amount set at $2,000 per person. And when the Prime Minister wanted to cut off CERB and leave families uncertain about the future, we fought back. New Democrats fought back and we won. But we're not out of the pandemic yet. There's still more that we need to do. Tout au long de cette pandémie.
Throughout the entire length of this pandemic, people have had a hard time paying their bills. They are fighting to feed their families and pay the rent. And we're not yet out of this crisis, this pandemic. Families and our economy need support to keep going on.
When we fought and pushed for the extension of CERB, there are still going to be many families that can't go back to work. There is no work for many people to go back to. Our families, Canadians, and our economy, Canada, needs that support to continue. But with today's fiscal snapshot, we're going to hear from Conservatives who've already laid out and started this argument that that help to Canadians must end. We know that the Liberals will also use the fiscal snapshot as an excuse to cut help to Canadians, to families that need the help. But this fiscal snapshot, though very serious, presents a very important opportunity for a choice. The choice is this. Anytime there is difficulty, we see government after government, in this case Liberal, in the past Conservative, quickly move to putting the pressure on working families, putting the brunt of the pain on everyday families. But they never move to ask the wealthiest, those at the very top, to pay their fair share. So if the government needs to cut costs, they should cut the costs of billions of dollars in giveaways to the wealthiest Canadians. If the government needs to cut costs, and I think the government should, then it should cut the cost of allowing billions of dollars to be lost to offshore tax havens. And if the government needs to increase revenue, which I believe we need to do in this difficult time, we know there are significant companies that have made massive profits during this pandemic, Netflix and Amazon, who pay almost no tax in Canada. And we know that the wealthiest, those at the very top, continue to amass fortunes. So we asked the government to put in place a wealth tax on those who have fortunes of over $20 million. Let's ask the wealthiest to bear the brunt of the pandemic, not the families and the working people who are struggling to get by. Aujourd'hui, avec...
Today, with the economic update, we've heard the Conservatives and Liberals use it as an excuse to try and reduce the support that people are still depending on. Instead of looking for ways to reduce assistance to those who need it most, the Prime Minister and his Liberal government need to stop letting the super rich avoid paying their fair share by giving them big tax giveaways and letting them hide billions in tax havens. If the government needs to cut costs, it should cut the cost of tax havens for our economy. With better choices, the Liberal government could get the wealthiest to pay their fair share.
Let's look at the choices. In a difficult economic situation, it is time for difficult choices. But far too often, the difficult choice always seems to be to cut the programs and services that families depend on, that families desperately need. That seems to be the choice of Conservative governments and often Liberal governments, that they quickly go to cutting the services and the programs that families that are in need are desperately relying on. But instead of that choice, I put forward another choice. The government can just as well, instead of cutting the services and programs to families in need, cut the giveaways, the massive giveaways to the wealthiest. We've just heard from the Parliamentary Budget Office talking about the $27 billion or more hidden in offshore tax havens. We know that the wealthiest Canadians continue to enjoy more and more wealth. Let's do two things: end offshore tax havens, ensure that the richest, the wealthiest Canadians, those with fortunes of over $20 million, pay their fair share with a tax on their fortunes of over $20 million, and use that revenue to pay for programs instead of cutting the services that families need. For New Democrats, the choice is clear. We will always be on the side of working people. We will always be on the side of people. We will not side with the powerful large corporations or the super wealthy. Now, throughout this pandemic, we've seen the Prime Minister and the Liberal government say some nice things. And even before, we've seen the Prime Minister and the Liberal government say some nice things. But when it comes down to it, those nice things they've said turn out to just be empty words. And I want to frame these choices and how the words of the Prime Minister have been so empty. We pushed the government to commit to helping Canadians who live with disabilities. And we pushed the government to commit to helping them without delay. Now, the Prime Minister then released a plan that does not help all Canadians, and it came months after the last thought was to help out Canadians with disabilities. They completely ignored them, and then when they provided some plan, that plan would not help all people living with disabilities. In fact, it wouldn't even help out the majority of Canadians living with disabilities. They had a choice. They could have included everyone who needed help. They had a choice to include all Canadians living with disabilities. The government, the Liberal government, had the choice and had the time to develop a plan that would help everyone in need. People getting CPP disability, veterans getting support, students, people receiving social assistance payments from provinces or territories. The choice to help making people, their choice was this. The Liberal government chose to make Canadians living with disabilities wait for help. But at the same time, where they told Canadians living with disabilities, you have to wait, you don't get to get the help you need right away, they immediately moved to help large corporations with effectively no restrictions. They wouldn't even restrict help to a company that is overtly cheating the system and not paying their fair share. To companies that use offshore tax havens, like other countries have done, they banned and they said they will not provide any help to a company that is using an offshore tax haven. Canada failed to do that. They helped big corporations that was supposed to go to working people, but instead, they didn't restrict companies receiving help to limit the bonuses paid to their CEOs to $1 million. So they're willing to give money to a company that continues to give help to the largest corporations. Lorsqu'il s'agit de ses amis bien branchés,
when it comes to his well-connected friends, the Prime Minister stops at nothing. But when it's people who are living with a disability, those individuals are waiting for this government to act.
But some quick comparables. Again, Canadians living with disabilities were told to wait, while friends of the government in We received $1 billion in a blink of an eye. The government and the Prime Minister talk about being feminist, but we know that in this pandemic, people living, women have been disproportionately impacted. And there is no recovery. There is no recovery in this economy if we don't accept the gendered lens of the impact and put forward a plan that addresses that gendered impact. And that means there is no recovery without investments in childcare.
Sorry, the time is up. I'm sure that the honourable member will be able to add during the questions and comments to anything he might have not been able to put forward. So questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'll say right up at the beginning, you know, it's been encouraging being on the government side and seeing the much higher sense of cooperation coming from the New Democratic Party in supporting many of the measures in which the government is proposing, contrasted to the official opposition who just opposes no matter what it is that we seem to bring forward, Madam Speaker. And my question to the Leader of the New Democratic Party is more so of one of acknowledgement, and that is to acknowledge, as most Canadians would, that by the different levels of government, and obviously including the federal government and the many different programs that we put into place, it all assists us in being in a better position to be able to be on a road for a healthier recovery, while at the same time we are saving lives and we are providing a better situation in terms of preventing the loss of lives or providing supports for our frontline services. And I wonder if you could just provide his thought.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Yes. I think it's one of the things that we have to really highlight when it comes to the response of this government has been that at every step of the way, the Liberal government has tried to do as little as possible. And it was only after we pushed and fought and demanded more for people that we were able to get more for people. And it wasn't like the Liberal government was going to do it anyways, or if it was a matter of speed. It was a matter of just not understanding the severity of the problem. And again, we see that with the lack of help for Canadians living with disabilities, that was a choice. Again, we see that with the lack of real commitments to helping women return to work. Knowing that women have been disproportionately impacted, we need to make sure the recovery plan addresses that by ensuring that there is a real plan to giving financing and support to childcare, which has been devastated as a result of this pandemic. So in moving forward, we need to put forward real solutions that address the problems that people are faced with, and we know that Liberal government won't do it unless we fight and push them to do so.
Questions and comments. L'honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
The Honourable Member for Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Member for his speech, always interesting, and even if we disagree on maybe nearly 90% of each and every issue, I do. This is what democracy is all about. Madam Speaker, we have seen this government spending billions of dollars in the last month with the result of that. Si on regarde la situation d'aujourd'hui, Monsieur le Président.
If we look at today's situation, Canada is unfortunately the worst off among G7 countries. Highest unemployment, only G7 country to have lost its credit rating going from AAA to AA, and no plan for economic reopening. What is the vision of the NDP's leader when it comes to these issues?
Oui, merci. Ce qu'on a...
Yes, thank you. When it comes to reopening the economy, many people are talking about how to go about it. When I think about this, when I reflect on how to reopen the economy, we can't go back to the old normal. The old normal is a situation where the most essential workers were the least paid, where seniors in nursing homes were the most impacted by the pandemic. What I want to see with the reopening of the economy is emphasis on improving our social programs, improving healthcare services, and that's how we can move forward. We have time for a brief question.
Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I've heard much from my constituents about how disappointed they are that Parliament would be shut down. And I can't help but think that it's ironic whenever the member, the leader of the fourth party in this House tweets out, the government should be doing this, that, or the other thing. And maybe they'd be able to, except that they voted to shut Parliament down. So my question is simple. Does he regret partnering with the Liberals in shutting down Parliament?
The honourable member for Burnaby South, a brief answer, please.
Yes, well, two things. First off, it's I would just remind the member where he is right now while he's speaking. This would not have happened but for our ability to be able to bring this forward. This was something we negotiated. But secondly, the member has to be very careful. The Conservative Party talks a lot about the importance of Parliament, but if you look at their attendance record, it doesn't really show that they think that is as important. So that is something that is somewhat problematic. When they raise a concern on one hand, it also draws a criticism on the other, and it doesn't look very good for the member or his party.
Before I go to the point of order, I do want to remind members, including the member for Battle River Crowfoot, that when someone else has the floor, that they shouldn't be shouting out or heckling during that time. I think that it's very disrespectful, and I think that every member needs to be listened to and heard, although we may not be in agreement, or you may not be in agreement with what is being said. The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot has a point of order.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and your point is well taken, and I do apologize that I do get impassioned in debate. My point of order is about referencing the attendance of members within this House. I know it was brought up a number of times during the previous COVID committee.
I'm going to rule that as a debate, and because the honourable member did not mention anybody in particular, and therefore it's not a point of order. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot has another point of order.
Yeah, I would speak to that previous point of order that he's specifically referencing the proceedings of what he is calling movement within this House, and
I would just indicate that he did not identify anybody in particular, and therefore the point of order is out of order. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And of course, any Canadian who wants to know what the attendance figures can look on the House of Commons website, and they will see the respective parties and which party, which will remain nameless, had only 40% attendance during the course of the last month. And the member from who just spoke could perhaps defend that record at some point. Madam Speaker, ça me fait plaisir de parler aujourd'hui.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to speak to the economic update. However, as the leader of the NDP has just said, we cannot say that everyone can agree on the fact that all of these programs cover everyone, because it is clear that some people have slipped through the cracks, including disabled persons. The exact number, $750 million for banks, but nothing for the disabled in Canada. 3 million Canadians live with a serious disability in Canada. So that has to be fixed. The government has to do something. I know the NDP leader and the NDP caucus is pushing the government on that point. The government has to do something. It has to address that issue, and it needs to help persons living with disabilities in Canada.
Repeat the very eloquent words of the leader of the NDP in terms of talking about this economic snapshot and the reality of this government not addressing the revenue side in any way which allows us to make the investments that will help people. He said it very eloquently. I think his words stand. What I would like to talk about is what a moment we are in at this time, in this place, in this country. The finance minister just stood in the House and said that all hands on deck, we are all in this together. And I think given the many neglected groups that we have been raising in the House, it's very clear that that is not the case yet. And it is not the case that Canada is responding the way it should to this pandemic. And to understand what we need to do now and what we need to do moving forward, we can look at the historical precedents of the Great Generation in the Second World War. Now, Madam Speaker, you're well aware of this. In the 1920s, we had, as we do today, incredible inequalities, a concentration of wealth that has not been repeated until now. In 1929, it reached its zenith. Today, as we know, because the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer has told us, 1% of Canadians now possess as much wealth as 80% of Canadians. That was the case in 1929, and that was one of the reasons why we had the Great Depression, a collapse of our economy. And then Canadians joined the fight against fascism, and Canadians went overseas. Many left their lives. Many did not survive. 2 members of my family are on the cenotaph in New Westminster in front of the City Hall. And so many other families across this nation sacrificed. And at that time, Madam Speaker, that generation said that we are in a watershed moment. We do not want to go back to the old normal, the normal of inequalities, the great economic meltdown that we saw. We want to build a better society. I'm not pretending, Madam Speaker, that the Great Generation was perfect. Of course, they did not deal with the reality of colonialism and addressing reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. They did not address systemic racism. They did not address those realities, and the devastation is still felt today. But despite the fact that that generation was not perfect, they did have a vision. And that vision was based on public investments and making sure that, as far as possible, nobody was left behind, that we would build, with public investment, a better country. And they set to work. And Madam Speaker, in my home in New Westminster, we were part of the house that my family and I reside in, built in 1948. We're part of the 300,000 affordable housing units that were built across the length and breadth of our country after the Second World War by people, that great society that decided that they were not going to return to the old normal, that they were going to build a better society, a more equitable and fair society. They built affordable housing. They built a network of hospitals and healthcare centers. And Madam Speaker, as you know, that generation, the Great Generation following the Second World War, also under the leadership of Tommy Douglas in a minority parliament, much like this one, put in place our universal healthcare center system that stands today as a pillar of one of the things that Canadians are most proud of. We built a system of education, colleges and universities, and high schools. We built highways and public transit. We ensured that there were water systems in many places. We neglected First Nations communities, there's no doubt. But there was a desire to build a new normal that was better than the old normal. And Madam Speaker, we are facing that same watershed moment today. As the leader of the NDP, the member from Burnaby South, has said so eloquently in this House, we have to build a better normal, a new normal. We have to be inspired by the Great Generation and how they responded to the Second World War. And what does that mean, Madam Speaker, when we talk about a new normal? What does that mean? Well, it means no longer accepting the idea that we are not going to in a very real sense end colonialism and put in place true and meaningful, lasting reconciliation with First Nations and Métis people. It means that we must fight, and the member from Burnaby South is the foremost leader in this House of Commons on this issue. We must fight and eliminate systemic racism in all our institutions and in our society. And we must be inspired by the Great Generation in terms of public investments, ensuring that nobody is left behind, whether we're talking about people with disabilities, whether we're talking about First Nations communities, whether we're talking about single-parent families. We need to make those public investments so that our new normal is different and much, much better than the old normal. I mean, the sobering statistics of the last few decades, after the Great Generation had finished its work, the subsequent governments, and I criticize equally Liberals and Conservatives in this regard, cut into pieces all that had been built following the Second World War. Cut into pieces that public financing, cut into pieces what was a fair tax system where everybody, rich or poor, paying their fair share of taxes, profitable corporations not being able to take their money offshore, but rather investing it in public investments here. Well, that was cut into pieces in subsequent decades. And now we have this watershed moment of great sacrifice that we are seeing from our frontline healthcare workers and first responders, putting their lives on the line every day. We've seen the devastation in our long-term care facilities. We've seen how people have stepped up, but we've also seen the horrible results and consequences of the thousands of lives lost in Canada. Their lives lost must stand for something. And that means we need to step up, both during the pandemic to make sure that nobody is left behind. And as the member from Burnaby South said eloquently just a few minutes ago, that starts with people with disabilities who have received no supports during this pandemic. And it means coming out in the rebuilding phase, that we have to build that new normal much better than the old. One that addresses the needs of everybody in this country. One that ensures meaningful national reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, that eliminates the systemic racism that we have seen afflict our country, like so many others, and to make sure that we put in place all of the investments that need to be put into place for the recovery. Things like childcare, things like access to post-secondary education, and the kind of job creation that comes with moving to a clean energy economy, which the member from Burnaby South has also spoken very eloquently to. We have a new normal to establish, Madam Speaker, and the NDP caucus is ready to work with all members of Parliament. So coming out of this pandemic, we have a much better country than going in. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Within the Liberal caucus, members virtually on a daily basis are bringing forward ideas and thoughts in terms of what it is that we could be doing in order to improve the many different programs we've brought in over the last few months to support Canadians. And this is something in which we have taken seriously, not only from government members, but also from opposition members, recognizing that we need to have that higher sense of cooperation in order to provide the better services that Canadians are going to need in a time of a pandemic. Madam Speaker, we've seen that through direct assistance, through CERB, through wage subsidy, through direct support for seniors, childcare, families, businesses, and so much more, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the member to the degree in which we do need to take this opportunity and to continue to explore ways in which we can better the system. We can maybe even continue on with some of the things that we started when we first took government 4, 5, 6 years ago, Madam Speaker. And I'm wondering if my friend could just provide his thoughts in terms of just continuing the momentum on many of those social policies that we started in the last number of months.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't disagree with the member, but We have raised repeatedly issues in this House that actually received the support of all members of Parliament. People with disabilities. It's now been 3 months since a motion passed unanimously through this House calling on the government to move immediately, without delay, to putting in place supports for all people with disabilities in this country. We are now 3 months later. Those Canadians with disabilities are struggling to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their head, and they have received no supports at all, despite the collaboration of every single member of Parliament. The government needs to act, and we know that they can act quickly. When the banks came and they didn't consult Parliament, $750 billion, $750 billion was handed out without batting an eye. It is time now for this government to people with disabilities. We have passed.
I'm sorry. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. On Monday, I had an opportunity to visit Suncor and Shell facilities in my own riding and just see the incredible adaptations that are happening in the energy sector to allow people to be able to continue to work, but all kinds of innovations in terms of safety protocols around ensuring that there isn't the spread of COVID-19. And really, that's what we need to do. We need to adapt so that people can get back to work. And I hear the members of the NDP talking about using this opportunity to dramatically change aspects of our social system, and we can obviously have those debates. But our central goal needs to be, I hope the member agrees, giving people the greatest possible opportunity to work in a safe way by supporting the deployment of adaptations. That's going to involve some changes, some expansion of certain sectors perhaps. I wonder if the member could comment on if he supports the Conservative proposal for a back-to-work bonus to help ensure that it is always more profitable for people to be able to return to work.
The honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And as the member knows, I came out of the oil and gas industry. I'm a former refinery worker at the Shelburne refinery in Burnaby, British Columbia, now closed, as did so many refineries, because we basically gutted the manufacturing and transformation part of that sector. And so I am a strong advocate for clean energy and believe in getting energy workers back to work in the clean energy sector. There is no doubt when we look at climate change, the climate emergency is already costing us $5 billion a year. In terms of economic costs, that is only going to accelerate, Madam Speaker, as you're well aware. That'll go to $50 billion over the next 2 decades. So we have to act now. And that means providing supports for that transition to clean energy. Now, the member also cites a transition in CERB. We have been pushing, as he's well aware, on transitional measures within the wage subsidy so that the wage subsidy is open to all businesses and nonprofits. We have not seen action from the government yet on that, but that is our priority for the moment.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the territory of the Algonquin Nation and once again express deep appreciation for their patience and generosity, make which. Today we look at the first ever in the history of Canada, tabled by a Minister of Finance, economic snapshot. We used to see full budgets, and we used to then have economic statements. But I am not going to find fault with the fact that we have a snapshot at the moment, because it's hard to know what else we could have. More economic information is always helpful, more transparency is always helpful, and it is clear that the Minister of Finance has made himself available to all parties in this place on a very frequent basis as we chart uncharted waters. Nothing has been perfect. Everything would have been better if delivered faster. But no one's ever gone through anything like this. No other government, no other generation. I suppose we could look at Black Death, but we didn't have access to Zoom meetings then, and we didn't have the ability to chart our course at all. So I would say that on balance, we've been doing as well, and in many cases better, than any government or any country around the world. That's saying something. But it's clearly a dismal economic forecast. We have now over $1 trillion in debt, and we have a deficit this year of $343 billion. It's not going to be easy to get out of this crisis, but it's very clear that our economic health is intrinsically tied to our personal health. Comme dans le rapport.
As the report says, and I quote, "The way forward towards a greener future remains uncertain, and it is closely connected to public health. And the area of public health is also uncertain. It's obvious that today we are living through a pandemic."
This is not normal spending. Nothing is about this is normal. But it's not disastrous. We have a path out of the economic disaster that is completely dependent on our path out of the health nightmare in which we find ourselves. Il n'a jamais osé avec.
It's never been as clear that the economy is stands behind nature. Today, nature is the boss.
Humanity, if we needed reminding that we're not in charge. We can have the best economic plans, we can have the best fiscal plans, we can have, as we had before this pandemic, the best debt to GDP ratio in the G7. We had full employment. We now have significant unemployment. None of this was foreseeable. A microscopic virus, a parasite, has attacked humanity. It leaves the animals alone for once. It's focused on humanity, and we spread it through our travel. We spread it through community spread. We've now learned all these new phrases, and we had to flatten that curve. The spending, for the most part, that we find described in this document was spending agreed to, and I think this speaks so well of us as parliamentarians. The spending was agreed to by unanimous consent. We rolled out extraordinary measures. We now know the names, the CERB. We're used to it now, our COVID emergency relief benefit to millions of Canadians. Rolled out help to businesses in the CEBA. We rolled out help in the wage subsidy. These things have helped our economy from being worse off than we now are. It held the drop in GDP to probably about 3 points less of a drop than we would have had. That's what the economic snapshot tells us. So our economy is doing better, and our health is doing better because our health and the economy are completely linked. I want to make the other point, of course, that our economy is also not in charge of the climate emergency. We as human beings can no more rewrite the genetic code of the COVID-19 virus than we can rewrite atmospheric chemistry. We cannot rewrite the rules of physics that mean that the climate emergency is a larger threat to our long-term survival than COVID-19. We can revisit and potentially rewrite some of our economic rules because we made those up. Humanity invented those. We can revisit them. We can certainly, for instance, consider that now might be a good time while we talk about unprecedented threats and unprecedented economic downturn. Frequent reference has been made, including by the Parliamentary Budget Office, to the fact that the comparisons with where we are now are not against where we were in 2008, 2009, but more reasonably, the end of the Second World War and during the Second World War. Our spending matches more of what we saw then. Our recovery will also match more of what we saw then, which means I mentioned in this House a few months ago, I'll mention again, I think Canada should step up in a lead role globally, or at least be a catalyst as a catalytic lead role and say, isn't it time to have something akin to the Bretton Woods Conference again? Don't we need to rethink what's the role of the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions that were created then, to help chart the global economy to recovery post-war. They worked then. International Monetary Fund set fixed currency rates. Since the Bretton Woods institutions and since that conference, the IMF has been relieved of fixing currency rates. We rewrote those rules. Maybe we need to rewrite some other rules. We are looking at a threat to life globally around the world in a post-pandemic famine threat to hundreds of millions of people around the world. And I know it's conventional wisdom for Canadians to say, we can't ask people when they're suffering in Canada to think about the poorest of the poor, but I think we have to. We will emerge from this crisis, this economic crisis, and the COVID-19 crisis, better off than most any other country on earth. And if hundreds of millions of people are dying from lack of food all around the world, that will not fail to reach our shores somehow. But we also have a role to play, and I think we really need to talk about forgiving all developing country debt from all around the world, so these countries that are the poorest of the poor have a fighting chance with additional help for food security to avoid the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, which are now predicted by United Nations relief and food agencies. We also need to rethink the fairness within Canada. This document makes it very clear that Finance Canada understands the need for childcare as I have never seen any Finance Canada document understand the need for childcare. It's clear that people who are looking at our economic health and recovery understand that parents can't go back to work if schools are closed, or if schools aren't safe, or if daycares aren't open, or if they don't have a daycare space. And as I say parents, and it happens there are a number of women MPs at the House at the moment, don't think it fails, and men who understand it too. Thank you to my honorable colleague who is smartly masked. Women, mothers, are the ones who are more likely to be staying home. This is a threat, a demographic threat, an economic threat, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1960s. The idea that, well, if things are bad and there's no child care, women will stay home. We know that's an economic blow we can't risk, and we know that's a step back in women's rights that we won't accept. We need child care for every child, and we need to be really creative about how we get there. This document points to what's called the Safe Restart Agreement. That is the $14 billion not yet allocated, not yet spent by the federal government to assist provinces. But $14 billion will not cover the 7 items on this list: child care, sick leave, health care capacity, and specifically looking at long-term care homes. I recently was talking to Shauna Stewart, who's the head of the union that represents long-term care workers across Canada, 60,000 workers. She told me that most of those workers are not yet back at work because they don't think the long-term care homes are a safe place for them to work. As long as long-term care homes are in the hands of for-profit enterprises, we cannot be sure that our seniors are going to be well cared for, nor that the workforce who goes in to take care of them, the frontline workers there, are safe, not to mention what kind of food people are served when you decide that you can cut corners every which way to make a profit in a long-term care home. We need to take a look at this federally. We need to figure out how we make Canada Health Act apply for national standards for long-term care homes. There's not enough money in this $14 billion, even for what the municipalities need by themselves, and they're 1 item out of 7 on the list. We need to do more. We need to be prepared to spend more. So with that, I'm going to focus as well on a point made earlier by my colleague from Burnaby. We still, although it's mentioned in here as though it's spent, we still have not done a single thing for people with disabilities. My colleague from New Westminster Burnaby, I'm afraid I abbreviated the name of his riding. The document we have in front of us was written as though the events on June 10th in this place had gone differently. June 10th in this place, the government agreed to split out of a bill that was not acceptable because it involved anything I found objectionable, But the one-time tax-free payment for Canadians with a valid disability tax credit, in order to be able to do that, we needed to make a legislative change in this place so that that information could be shared from CRA so that the one-time tax credit benefit could go to people receiving the disability tax credit. Bear in mind, that is not the full range of people living with disabilities in Canada who need help, but at least it was a step, and I wanted to take that step. And when we asked for unanimous consent, we didn't get it. Shame on those who said no. We had that one step to take. The Liberal House Leader put it before us for unanimous consent, and it should have gone through. But we have to figure out how to get help to people with disabilities, and we have to do it quickly. There are a number of areas that remain unmet, needs that are unmet, and that's in the context of the immediate crisis. When we get past the immediacy of the crisis and build towards restarting our economy, that's where I think we really need to think big. I don't know how many of you noticed the column by Brian Mulroney that appeared as a full-page ad in the Globe and Mail, the back page of one day's paper a few weeks ago. I was pleased to see him call for guaranteed livable income. That's one of the things that I think my colleagues, they're all shaking, they're all agreeing from the benches of the New Democratic Party and Greens. We are firm in our desire to see the CERB transfer over time and quickly to a guaranteed livable income. In the other place, the leader of the Independent Senate group asked the Parliamentary Budget Office to look at this and found it would be cheaper than CERB to do it. But that's even without taking into account the savings that would accrue to our public health care system, to our correction system. We need to move to guaranteed livable income as part of the next transformative step. The honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby talked about what happened in this House in the late 1960s, early 70s, when Tommy Douglas and David Lewis and in the government of the Right Honourable Lester B. Pearson put in place the fundamentals of our social safety net. We haven't taken a significant transformative step since. We need to bring in pharmacare, we need to bring in guaranteed livable income. These are the steps that we need when we reimagine our future post-pandemic. We can build back to build back better. We can make sure we don't bounce back, but bounce forward. There are many ways that the phrases are circulating these days in a very active, robust discussion. But that discussion isn't on the fringes when it's Brian Mulroney, our former Prime Minister, Progressive Conservative, talking about what we need to do, that we need to think big, that we need to be bold. I really loved his takeaway line, quote, "Incrementalism builds increments." We are not in a place right now, dear friends, to build increments. We need to rebuild our economy. We need to restart our economy, and we need to do it in a way that leaves no one behind, including the poorest of the poor wherever they are around the world. We need to step up and take a role that says the climate agenda can't wait. The climate emergency doesn't wait. The climate negotiations for 2020 are postponed till 2021. But if we decide that climate action can also be postponed to 2021, we will certainly play a dangerous game of Russian roulette with our children's future. We need to ensure that as we go forward, and yes, we will need to continue spending, that we invest in renewable energy, in energy efficiency for all of our buildings in retrofits, and we need to also look at things according to global studies on what stimulates the economy best, gets people back to work, and makes a big difference, including things as simple as tree planting, lots of it. So as I look at this economic and fiscal snapshot, I have to say that I find it encouraging. Very few people could look at a fiscal snapshot that says $343 billion deficit and find it encouraging, but we're facing it. And in looking at the economic indicators and our own strength as a nation in being able to handle this, we can. We are very, very fortunate that we went into this with the economic health and the strength that we did. We have a lot of companies that are still struggling. We mustn't let, if we can help it, we have to help avoid bankruptcies. We have to help small business. We have to ensure our municipalities receive the help they need. And to do that, the federal government must continue to spend. To do otherwise, to be frightened by people who say, well, look at the red ink, is to risk a deep depression. We are going to have to continue to go down this road. And the best way to do that, I believe now, is to look at modern monetary theory and ask ourselves why we want to borrow from commercial banks when, as long as we're dealing with sovereign wealth and sovereign debt, we can borrow from ourselves and keep those funds within Canada and not let us be at the mercy of commercial banks or New York bond raiders. It's time to say, what do we do as a sovereign nation? How do we embrace our future and do it without the, I don't want to say bean counter, narrow-minded, lack of vision kinds of folks out there. I want to say, let's be as positive about this as we can be. Let's be innovative. When we look at the problem, for instance, for schools opening, we know that schools can't open because there's not enough space to have physical distancing for the children because the schools are small compared to what's going to be needed. We've got to stop thinking about jurisdictional barriers and be really creative. Where is there a lot of empty space for school children? I think it's the convention centers that are going to stay empty. Can't we think past our own jurisdictional constitutional boundaries for once and say, this is an emergency. If we want kids back at school and we want teachers back teaching them, which is what teachers want, where do we have assets that can be mobilized quickly? It's now early July. Schools are supposed to open in September. Nobody really has a plan that I can see. So yes, we need childcare. Yes, we need our schools opening. Yes, we need to work together federally, provincially, municipally, with Indigenous governments, Métis, Inuit, First Nations. Every set of smart, innovative, creative Canadians need to come to the table. And when we come to the table, let's come not ready to bash each other down, but help bring each other up. Because as Canadians, we know we are blessed. We know we are not out of the woods yet, we know that. But we're smart enough to know we listen to the science. We have to listen to the science on COVID-19. We have to listen to the science on the climate emergency. And we have to look to those who are the most innovative, the most creative throughout our economy. And with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity for sharing some thoughts about this snapshot, which I hope I have delivered back to everyone in what we no longer have, Kodak, full-color spectrum, Kodachrome. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Long Range Mountains.
And always it's a pleasure to listen to my friend and colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands. I'm on one coast of this country and she's on the other. I've been in Ottawa the last couple of days with another colleague on FIWO, Status of Women meetings, and it was very clear that we heard the impact that COVID-19 has had on women from coast to coast to coast. Indigenous women, women of color, women in the new workforce, women in the old workforce. And we also heard the Finance Minister make mention of that today, the impact that COVID-19 is having severely on women in our country. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague, going forward as we look down the road of recovery, what advice does she have for my minister, the Minister of Women and Gender Equality, of how we get women back on the level playing field and how we get our economy going, knowing that women is a good part of it?
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, I want to thank my friend from Long Range Mountains. This document is exceptional for the depth of analysis on gender-based analysis of a statement. I don't think I've ever seen Annex 1 of this for people watching us from home is taking it program by program, sector by sector. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected women? So the gender-based assessment is clear. I would say the answer is three things: childcare, childcare, childcare. Women right now are at risk of being put back in the home because there's no one else to look after the kids, and we need childcare.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate a couple of the attitudes that the Honourable Member mentioned in her speech, and that's the need for creativity and the need to be positive. And when it comes to the need for creativity, I wish there was more creative thinking in terms of making sure that Parliament could have sat over the last 3 months so we could have had fulsome and regular debates, including private members' business and whatnot, over these past number of months as this country faced an unprecedented crisis. And certainly when it comes to the attendance, of members. I know a number of members that are not listed in the minutes, as some of my other colleagues have mentioned, because they had to watch on CPAC because of technical challenges. So I wish that creativity could have been exercised in this place. But specifically to my honourable friend across the way, I think that unleashing that positive entrepreneurial spirit is absolutely key to a good recovery. And I know that there are many examples, specifically within the energy sector in my constituency, cutting-edge environmental science that is moving our world-class energy industry forward, but we need a plan to move forward. And unfortunately, the fiscal update today did not outline a plan to move forward. It was simply that looking back. And I wonder if the member agrees that over the last number of months, the 700+ staff in the Department of Finance could have been working on a budget that certainly I would have been happy to sit this summer and debate, so that we as Canadians and as members of Parliament could see the plan for this country going forward, as opposed to a fiscal selfie that simply talks about the $350-some billion deeper in the red that will be.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. I thank my friend for Battle River Crowfoot for giving me the perfect opportunity to say, I can't imagine how we could be sitting physically in this place without being a threat to the health of the people in our communities at home and to our own health. And I don't understand why the Conservatives persist in saying we could be sitting here. All we need, and I'm begging the Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot to be the voice of reason within his caucus, let us vote remotely. We're voting from home in British Columbia's legislature, which includes some very far-flung areas. We are voting remotely in British Columbia. Other countries are voting remotely. If we could vote remotely, we could bring forward private members' bills. We could bring forward the bill that's languishing for medical assistance in dying reform, which is desperately needed. We could be bringing forward the legislation we need for a Climate Accountability Act. We are in this place unable to pass something as simple as allowing the Government of Canada to have eyes on who receives the disability tax credit because of a refusal to go with unanimous consent. We need to vote remotely. In a pandemic, not otherwise, but in a pandemic, we need to function fully.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to comment and ask a few questions of the minister or the member from Saanich Gulf Islands. I was moved by the comments we've heard from the member for Burnaby South, the New Westminster Burnaby, and the member from Saanich Gulf Islands. In terms of building back better, in terms of our opportunity to do this, one of the things that I notice is that what we have right now is a global pandemic, and it will require a global response. And we understand that we can't stop the pandemic if we try to be insular within Canada. So I really did appreciate the comments that the member made, but I wonder if she would agree with me that we would love to see a recommitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the high-level political forum at the United Nations right now, virtually, of course, but whether or not we should be reconfirming to our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, and whether we could have a 1% of our COVID spending, just 1% of our COVID spending, going to help those around the world that are suffering so much at this time.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. And I want to also thank the Honourable Member for Edmonton and Strathcona for her leadership on the issues that relate to ending poverty globally. I do wear the pin, this pin for people who are wondering. The public health officer for the province of Quebec wears it. So people say to me, well, where did you get that, from Quebec? This is the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and Canada is committed to them. We should recommit, and it is absolutely appropriate to say we should Our goal should be 0.7% long-term of our GNI going to overseas development assistance. And in this pandemic, 1% of COVID spending must go to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Interesting statistic out of the Surrey Board of Trade in British Columbia. Since the pandemic, BC has lost about 350,000 jobs. But of that, about 250,000, or about 72%, represent people in precarious work. And I think we can do better. As we go forward, and I'd like the Honourable Member from Saanich and Gulf Islands to comment on this, we can do better for them. Not just for them individually, but as people who represent a wasted resource in Canada. This is human energy that we're frittering away on work of relatively low value. And I'm wondering what she would see in the future that would lift these people up and lift all of Canada up along with them.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my honourable friend from Fleetwood Port Kells. He's absolutely right. We've talked about this before, that what we accepted as normal in the past wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough in terms of long-term care homes. It wasn't good enough in terms of people being left behind in our economy, falling through the cracks. It wasn't good enough for people dealing with the opioid crisis. And for particularly young people, there are a lot of people in what gets called now the gig economy. No job security, very precarious circumstances. One of the best ways to deal with this is guaranteed livable income. That everybody knows they've got enough for their bare maintenance needs to stay above the poverty line, and then you earn income beyond that. We're going to be hit. I mean, the world of work was going to change soon anyway, and the Canadian Labour Congress did a big study on this, by artificial intelligence. We have to plan ahead for some rather large headwinds that we still haven't faced, and one of them is AI, the other is the climate emergency, and we continue to deal with pandemic. It means, I think, we create a social safety net that really does ensure that everybody is at least able to keep a roof over their head and their kids fed, and after that, you keep working and you figure out how you're going to make money, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a school teacher, whether you're a frontline healthcare worker. You need to know that you're not so precarious that it would only mean one lost paycheck and you fall between the cracks.
Questions and comments? We have time for about a 30-second question and maybe a 30-second answer. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. My colleague raised many issues. I just wanted to pick up on the issue of long-term care. Clearly an important issue, and we have to think about how we do better, how we support people better. And I think sometimes we get caught in this dichotomy between private for-profit and public provision, forgetting that a lot of services are delivered through private not-for-profit. And when you have private not-for-profits, there's generally so much more engagement of volunteer hours, involvement in the community. This can produce very good outcomes. But we also have a problem, and it's represented by the Delta Hospice, which is close to where the member maybe gets off when she's taking the ferry to Vancouver, which is that when there is a threat to the ability of institutions to exist according to their own values, to define the protection of their own conscience, that drives certain organizations out of participation in private not-for-profit care. Would the member agree that we want to increase the involvement of private not-for-profits, and one way to do that is to ensure the protection of conscience for those that are volunteering their time and efforts in order to provide a good long-term care for our seniors? Good question.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands in 30 seconds or less.
I have just enough time to thank the Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. No, I think I have a little bit more time than that. I couldn't agree more about the role played by private not-for-profit. There are wonderful care homes in my riding, operated not by government agencies, obviously, but by nonprofit societies. And I do agree we need to protect rights of conscience for individual workers. At the institutional level, it becomes far more difficult, and I think we will part company on the questions relating to some of the tangential, but perhaps core elements of why he asked the question. I agree we need to look at nonprofit, privately run healthcare facilities and really celebrate the work of the volunteers in those facilities.
Il est mon devoir de vous faire savoir.
It is my duty to inform the House that the committee will, rather that the motion is now considered expired and the motion is deemed withdrawn.